of annoyance and a little relief. She would not have to walk home alone. But with Romney Penhallow? Would he think she had contrived it so purposefully? Romney silently opened the gate for her, silently latched it behind her, and silently fell into step beside her. Down across a velvety sweep of field they went. The air was frosty, calm, and still. Over the world lay a haze of moonshine and mist that converted East Grafton's prosaic hills and fields into a shimmering fairyland. At first Lucinda felt angrier than ever. What a ridiculous situation! How the Penhallows would laugh over it! As for Romney, he too was angry with the trick impish chance had played him. He liked being the butt of an awkward situation as little as most men, and certainly to be obliged to walk home over moonlit fields at 1 o'clock in the morning with the woman he had loved and never spoken to for 15 years was the irony of fate with a vengeance. Would she think he had schemed for it? And how the deuce did she come to be walking home from the wedding at all? By the time they had crossed the field and reached the wild cherry lane beyond it, Lucinda's anger was mastered by her saving sense of humour. She was even smiling a little maliciously under her fascinator. The lane was a place of enchantment, a long moonlit colonnade adown which beguiling wood nymphs might have footed it featly. The moonshine fell through the arcing boughs and made a mosaic of silver light and clear-cut shadow for the unfriendly lovers to walk in. On either side was the hovering gloom of the woods, and around them a great silence, unstirred by wind or murmur. Midway in the lane, Lucinda was attacked by a sentimental recollection. She thought of the last time Romney and she had walked home together through this very lane from a party at young John's. It had been moonlight then, too, and Lucinda checked a sigh. They had walked hand in hand. Just here, by the big grey beech, he had stopped her and kissed her. Lucinda wondered if he were thinking of it too, and stole a look at him from under the lace border of her fascinator. But he was striding moodily along with his hands in his pockets and his hat pulled down over his eyes, passing the old beech without a glance at it. Lucinda checked another sigh, gathered up an escarped flutter of voile, and marched on. Past the lane, a range of 3 silvery harvest fields sloped down to Peter Penhallow's brook, a wide, shallow stream bridged over in the olden days by the mossy trunk of an ancient fallen tree. When Lucinda and Romney arrived at the brook, they gazed at the brawling water blankly. Lucinda remembered that she must not speak to Romney just in time to prevent an exclamation of dismay. There was no tree. There was no bridge of any kind over the brook. Here was a predicament. But before Lucinda could do more than despairingly ask herself what was to be done, now Romney answered, not in words, but in deeds. He coolly picked Lucinda up in his arms as if she'd been a child instead of a full-grown woman of no mean avoirdupois, and began to wade with her through the water. Lucinda gasped helplessly. She could not forbid him, and she was so choked with rage over his presumption that she could not have spoken in any case. Then came the catastrophe. Romney's foot slipped on a treacherous round stone. There was a tremendous splash, and Romney and Lucinda Penhallow were sitting down in the middle of Peter Penhallow's brook. Lucinda was the first to regain her feet. About her clung, in heart-breaking limpness, the ruined voile. The remembrance of all her wrongs that night rushed over her soul, and her eyes blazed in the moonlight. Lucinda Penhallow had never been so angry in her life. "You damned idiot!" she said, in a voice that literally shook with rage. Romney meekly scrambled up the bank after her. "I'm awful sorry, Lucinda," he said, striving with uncertain success to keep a suspicious quiver of laughter out of his tone. It was wretchedly clumsy of me, but that pebble turned right under my foot. Please forgive me for that and for other things." Lucinda deigned no answer. She stood on a flat stone and wrung the water from the poor green voile. Romney surveyed her apprehensively. "Hurry, Lucinda," he entreated. "You will catch your death of cold." "I never take cold. answered Lucinda with chattering teeth. "And it is my dress I am was thinking of. You have more need to hurry. You are sopping wet yourself, and you know you are subject to colds. There, come." Lucinda picked up the stringy train, which had been so brave and buoyant 5 minutes before, and started up the field at a brisk rate. Romney came up to her and slipped his arm through hers in the old way. For a time they walked along in silence. Then Lucinda began to shake with inward laughter. She laughed silently for the whole length of the field, and at the line fence between Peter Penhallow's land and the Grange acres she paused, threw back the fascinator from her face, and looked at Romney defiantly. "You are thinking of that," she cried, "and I am thinking of it, and we will go on thinking of it at intervals for the rest of our lives. But if you ever mention it to me, I'll never forgive you, Romney Penhallow." "I never will," promised Romney. There was more than a suspicion of laughter in his voice this time, but Lucinda did not choose to resent it. She did not speak again until they reached the Grange gate. Then she faced him solemnly. "It was a case of atavism," she said. "Old Grandfather Gordon was to blame for it. At the Grange almost everybody was in bed. What with the guests straggling home at intervals and hurrying sleepily off to their rooms, nobody had missed Lucinda, each set supposing she was with some other set. Mrs. Frederick, Mrs. Nathaniel, and Mrs. George alone were up. The perennially chilly Mrs. Nathaniel had kindled a fire of chips in the blue-room grate to warm her feet before retiring, and the three women were discussing the wedding in subdued tones when the door opened and the stately form of Lucinda, stately even in the draggled voile, appeared, and with the damp Romney behind her. "Lucinda Penhallow!" gasped they, one and all. "I was left to walk home," said Lucinda coolly. "So Romney and I came across the fields. There was no bridge over the brook, and when he was carrying me over, he slipped and we fell in. That is all. No, Cecilia, I never take cold, so don't worry. Yes, my dress is ruined, but that is of no consequence. No, thank you, Cecilia. I do not care for a hot drink. Romney, do go and take off those wet clothes of yours immediately. No, Cecilia, I will not take a hot foot-bath. I am going straight to bed. Good night." When the door closed on the pair, the three sisters-in-law stared at each other. Mrs. Frederick, feeling herself incapable of expressing her sensations originally, took refuge in a quote. "Do I sleep? Do I dream? Do I wonder and doubt? Is things what they seem, or is visions about?" "There will be another Penhallow wedding soon," said Mrs. Nathaniel with a long breath. "Lucinda has spoken to Romney at last." "Oh, what do you suppose she said to him?" cried Mrs. George. "My dear Cecilia," said Mrs. Frederick, "we shall never know." They never did know. End of The Winning of Lucinda by L.M. Montgomery.